You are now listening
You are now listening to the Black Male Educators Alliance podcast.
Lifting our voices.
Lifting our voices.
Welcome everybody to another episode of the BMEA Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Waston. As always, joined by my co-host, Mike Payne. Mike, how you doing?
Good. How you guys doing?
Good. And we have a special guest joining us this evening. We have Dr. Karlin J. Tichenor. Karlin, how you doing?
I'm well. Hope everybody's doing well also.
Good. Thanks for being here. We have a lot to get into in this episode. We're going to get to know Karlin a lot better for those who haven't heard him speak or got to know him yet. But we're also going to talk about the upcoming mental health series that Karlin will be helping us put on here at the organization. So let's just kind of jump in. I want to first just kind of introduce the listeners to who Dr. Tichenor is in case you haven't heard of him before, had the opportunity to hear him speak. Dr. Tichenor was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, graduated from Pike High School there. And he actually he has his undergrad degree from Denison University. He ended up at Michigan State where he got his master's and your PhD from MSU?
Yes, sir. Go green.
Go white, yes. Sorry, Mike. You BMEA, this is a special thing we got.
Yeah, I got you.
But he's done a lot of great work, and we're going to talk about it. And we'll talk about how we met and a lot of work he's done in the Lansing area, in the Lansing School District. Just recently, a few months ago, he actually moved back to his hometown of Indianapolis, so that's pretty cool. And before the show, we were talking about just how it is being back, because I think everyone asks that question when you move back. So how is it now? And you're just sharing how it's been different, just getting adjusted to being there as an adult versus when he left town at 17. So maybe we'll get into that a little bit as well. But one thing we like to do when we start off, Karlin, is just asking the guests who they are, what they do, and why they do the work that they do.
Yeah. I appreciate that question. It's a loaded question, so I'll try to be very brief in terms of my response. But who I am, first and foremost, I'm a believer in God, and I'm a believer in family, and I value family. I value relationships. I think that those are the strongest connections that we have in this world, and being able to foster them and develop them are really critical to living, I think, a well life, a holistic life. I believe in the work that I do, particularly because I want to create spaces where people can develop relationships and become the best version of themselves. I know a lot of people have different challenges as they grow up, as they matriculate from childhood to adulthood. And I think those challenges can inform us and not necessarily derail our goals in our lives. And so I do this work because I want people to see struggle and challenge as opportunity. And I want people to ultimately become the best versions of themselves, whatever they define that as.
Good. And then just for the people to be a little more specific, so what's a typical day like? What do you do for your work on a day-to-day basis? Yeah.
So currently, a couple of things. So I'll tell a quick story. Curtis and I, and we'll learn about how we met, but Curtis and I used to live together, and he had like 4 or 3 jobs, and I had 2 at the time. And he came home in the middle of the day. I was taking a nap, and he said, "Man, you a bum." And I'm like, "Bro, I got 2 jobs. What do you mean?" He said, "You a bum." Now, it turns out he was just frustrated because he had a dissertation to write, and he was sort of stressed out. But he took a shot. That shot actually was not healthy for me because I started to think, well, I need to do more. So my short answer to your question is I have a few jobs at this point. All of them, though, connect to my passion. So right now, I'm a director of social emotional health at the Indiana Youth Institute. It's a statewide nonprofit. I'm an adjunct professor at Butler University. And then I have a business with my brother. It's a social services agency called Family Links. We have a contract with the Department of Child Services specifically. And then lastly, the work that I do, which has me on here, is the consulting firm, which is Karlin J and Associates. So a day in the life is really just managing between those different competing areas of focus, but ultimately connected to a larger passion of mine, which is to die empty. Make an impact on this world, make sure that the world knew I was here, and make sure that the world knew I cared about other people.
Mike?
Yeah, that's really dope, man. I think it's interesting what you were saying about your passions, all the things you were saying about why you do what you do is kind of similar to what we do in education, but it's interesting that it's two different fields, but it gives you the same intrinsic like feeling and reward. So I think that's really dope, man.
Yeah, no, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about me ending up in education, but I think there's a lot of overlap between the fields in terms of motivations and wanting to help others, and the way we help others might be a little bit nuanced, but ultimately it's about impact and improving outcomes for people, which I think all of us share uniquely.
And I'm always happy to meet brothers in career paths that are not necessarily super popular, because it's good for our kids to kind of get an insight to it, so they can see where some of their passions and also some of their character traits can fit into a role that would be rewarding to them. So it's just as important it is for like us to have Black male teachers. It's very important for us to have Black male psychologists and social workers, things like that, because that gives our kids an opportunity to see a little bit of what they have, what they can become. Yeah,
and I think it normalizes certain things that are taboo and stigmatized in our society, right? Like the Black male is an educator, the Black male is a therapist. That means that I'm comfortable and okay with relationships and emotions and even some challenges psychologically. And what that means for us as that makes us whole people, right? None of us are fully healthy. All of us have our challenges and have to process them in the best way possible. And I believe that one avenue is through therapy. And so being able to reinforce that in my positioning while also helping kids recognize that it's okay to process in healthy ways, and you can come to me or any other person of color in this field, but in particular that it's okay and do it in ways that make sense for you, and therapy is an option.
Yeah, I agree.
That's great. And I really like hearing, kind of like Mike said, different career paths, because here, first of all, when anyone watching the video, they can see like you're a young guy. You're not some old guy, but here you are, you got a PhD, but also you have these different roles, because I think a lot of young people, they shy away from hard work because it's like, it may just be difficult, or it may lead to a lifestyle that's not really what I want. But here you are, you look like, I mean, we all kind of look the same in how we dress. Like, you're not in the suit, but you have this flexibility, and you're making a lasting impact on something that you're passionate about. And that's something I always want to make sure young people are just finding that passion and then like go all out at it. Don't just put a limitation on yourself. Like really just go after it. So like I said, man, I'm excited to get into this.
Absolutely.
Let's transition a little bit, because you have done a lot of work in education, even though you weren't like a teacher by, degree or just necessarily title, but you've done so much. And I was reading your biography and I learned something I didn't even know. You actually started a mentoring program back when you were at Denison called the Boys to Men Mentoring Program. So talk to us a little bit about what that was and what led you to start it.
Yeah, so the Boys to Men Mentoring Program was through it was our Black Student Union. So our Black Student Union had several committees, and they had a chair that was ultimately responsible for bringing the brothers together, and the Black males in particular under that organization. What I did instead was, the way I wanted to bring us together was in service. And so we identified a local high school, Newark High School, and we garnered some relationships and built that. And then over the last period, we would go and do some mentoring with the young brothers. And then after hours, when we had the ability to, we would take them to different locations to enjoy our time, to enjoy their time, even back to the university. The intention was to really develop social skills primarily, and to develop some relationships with college-going minority males, ultimately so that those young people could see themselves in the college setting, but also so that we could do work beyond our safe community of the college. And this was a predominantly white institution, relatively private in terms of the amount of students that went there. It's 2,500 liberal arts institution. And so we didn't ever really have to leave campus. Which meant that we could be safe in our bubble. And I thought that it was a needful thing for us to go and impact the community. Now, where that came from was really my experience at Michigan State University. I was there in the McNair program for a semester, and that's actually how I met Curtis. He happened to be my professor of our qualitative research class. And they were designing and developing a mentoring program that was connected to a larger project, which was connected through Michigan State University and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Now, Curtis was responsible for the mentoring part of it, and I volunteered to connect to that program Fast forward, we ended up being more formalized in our role in that program. But that was my motivation to take that same kind of concept back to my university, because I learned to believe in the importance of mentoring, particularly in urban settings.
That's dope. That's dope. And then I know you talked about how you met Curtis, and as Dr. Curtis Lewis, for the people listening in the past, kind of connected to the co-founder of BMEA. And that's actually how me and Karlin met that same summer, working in the same program. So it's just kind of interesting how this all kind of connected. Well, obviously you end up coming back to Michigan State. What led to that decision?
Yeah. Long story short, I applied to graduate school and I got into one place, a couple of places, but the place I wanted to go, I did not get into. So Northwestern I got into, and I wanted to go and work simultaneously while I was in Chicago, but the program I was referred into or allowed into was a 10-month really quick program, and so they didn't allow us to work. Well, I couldn't afford graduate school without working. It was impossible. So I deferred a year, ended up doing McNair again, Ronald E. McNair program again, and I chose Michigan State to do that. Through my first experience there, I was able to develop some relationships that allowed me to have access to the program for a second year. And so I did the McNair program and ended up becoming an AmeriCorps member for the next year after that.
Gotta unmute myself.
Yeah.
Now I know what that feels like. I'm normally always on top of it, and I'm telling other people like unmute.
Yeah. We all been there.
Yeah. So a large part of your career you spent working in Lansing School District, and I know you did some impactful things there. So take us through that journey. Like, what did you start off with in the Lansing School District, and maybe set some context for the listeners around the city of Lansing, for people who may not be familiar. I know we have a lot of people in the Detroit area, and not everyone knows. So maybe set some context to that school district and some of the work you were doing.
Yeah. So context. So Michigan State, and this is why I'm forever indebted to Michigan State. My experience at Michigan State led me to have opportunities to create relationships and skills to be able to do work in the Lansing community. And it's important for me to acknowledge that without Michigan State and the relationships that were created there, that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do work in Lansing. Now, Lansing specifically is an urban community. In comparison to Detroit, the population size is not the same, but Lansing is the capital. Most people don't know that about Michigan, that Lansing is the capital. They assume that Detroit is the capital. It's not actually the case. So there's a highly politicized environment there. The urban school district is, in a lot of ways, the way the mayors really dictate or discuss their intended impact as it relates to educational outcomes for youth. And because it is the capital, obviously the governor is also situated there, state senators, et cetera. And so being mindful of that context. And then there's a sort of a combination of communities that exist in Lansing, from Chicago to Detroit. When people leave Chicago and they want to go east, they tend to end up in Lansing as they transition down that train line, right? And so thinking about there's a growing reality around urbanization that also includes some forms of violence. Now, in terms of the violence that most major cities experience, there is no comparison, but there is a growing trend of violence. Poverty is real there, and the chasm between those who have and those who have not is consistent with any other urban demographic, statistically speaking. So that's the environment. How I ended up there was through Michigan State and some work that we were doing with a statewide project called First School. The would-be superintendent ended up being my boss in that, in my role as a research assistant. And then from there, as she was asked to come on to the district to do basically a short evaluation of the district to provide recommendations to the board, they ended up offering her a position as the superintendent. Shortly after that, she saw a need for behavior intervention in the schools. And so she asked me to come on board to design a program that would focus on 5 particular schools, ultimately to reduce risk behavior in those contexts. And so that led to several other opportunities throughout my tenure there, which ultimately ended up in the Associate Superintendency of School Culture.
Like, you want to add anything?
No, man, I think what's interesting your comparison of Lansing as like an urban environment, and then also just how that plays a role in how important your work is. You know, in terms of like what we can see from our kids coming from the dynamics and demographics they're coming from. And I think oftentimes people don't see that or recognize that when the city's not a big name city. I come from Delaware, which is a small state. We have obviously urban environments because it's in between of Baltimore and Philadelphia. And so oftentimes people just don't recognize the necessities of the smaller urban communities that have the same needs as the larger ones.
Yeah. I think we have definitions of urban as population size, but I think of us define urban not by population size, but by the high density of minority populations and also low income realities, right? And that's how I tend to define urban. And if I define urban that way, then Lansing was definitely urban.
Right. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You know, so listeners, if you never knew anyone from Delaware, you know Mike, you know someone from Delaware. Because before that, I never knew anyone from Delaware.
I didn't know that either.
But I wanna hit on something you mentioned, Karlin, and like there's this thing I think professionally, like relationships were very impactful on you, and for the young people listening, even for the adults, because no matter how old you get, you still need relationships. How did you go about cultivating such positive relationships? Was that something inherent, or like where did that come from? Because I know a lot of people, they think it's just about their skill set and, I'm going to just go after it. But you obviously tended to those things and it paid off in a lot of great ways to complement, obviously, your skill set and just you personally.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Chris. And it's not a simple answer because I would love to say that I was mindful of that initially and that I had the blueprint and I was strategic. It's not true at all. I'm a first generation college kid and I couldn't ever call home and ask for advice. They had no idea what to tell me. And so I would say, number one, it was favor. And then number two, it was listening to the environment around me and then paying attention to what people were saying. So I'll give a really clear point. When I was at Denison, I was not sociable. I played basketball and then I was in a frat, but I didn't necessarily put myself out there to be around everybody all the time because I'm an introvert by nature. But I would see this woman named Lisa Scott. She would come to the Black Student Union events and she seemed to have this presence. And something inside of me, as well as watching other people entreat her, said, you need to meet her. And I use this as an example as that's the way I began to do things moving forward. And so I walked in her office one day and I said, I don't know why I'm supposed to know you, but I'm supposed to know you. And she looked at me and she's the reason why ultimately I ended up in the McNair program because we started to cultivate a relationship. And so that same strategy I would use later on. Once I got to McNair, I would just sort of allow myself to be in places where I was uncomfortable, but I felt led to be there. And so that's how I walked up to Curtis and said, I want to volunteer. I was led to do that. And then I listened to the leading in I would say my spirit, but also the energy around what the program sounded like. And so I put myself out there. And I think that's what I learned to do is to put myself out there. And I think people see me put myself out there and they would respond with, oh, I think he could, and let's give him a shot. And I'll end this with this last story. And that's how I ended up developing a relationship with the would-be superintendent. Even though I worked for her, I could have been silent, but I would go to these events that she would be responsible for leading. And there were trainings with principals, lead teachers, and entire school communities that were the leadership team. And I would go and I would listen and I observe. And then eventually I was led to write a 5-page response to something that I observed. And obviously I was in school and I was becoming more critically minded. Though I wasn't in the field of education, my critical mind training was allowing it to apply to education. So I wrote a paper and I sent it to her. And it was a criticism of her training, the training, and the field of education. That, I think, prompted her to see what I was capable of doing. And I think that set with her, in addition to the fact that I think I worked hard while I was in that role. And so a combination of taking chances, listening to your heart and your head, seeing opportunity and not being afraid, and then also listening to people and learning from the environment around you and sort of combining all those together to take the step forward.
That's dope, man. That's dope. That's really, I mean, like Chris was saying, that's really important for our students to know. And part of what I've been thinking about is like, there are like, as education is transforming and we're going through this transitional stage, like what are some really important like skills and also key information kids need to know in their transition? And I think what you just said there is so important. Like no matter what content knowledge you have, or no matter like, you know, how academically intelligent you are, there are certain skills that are going to help you get to where you need to go. And there's a certain mindset you got to have in order for you to be successful at every next level that you enter into.
Yeah, Mike, absolutely. And I'll just add to that idea that I think we highlight a lot of technical skills and those hard skills, and those are important. But I think soft skills and the ability to connect, to relate, to listen attunely, to be connected to the ideas of people, and then to put that information in your mind. Not to assume that all the information you hear is irrelevant. Assume that it's important. It just might not be useful right now.
Right.
Develop that skill of listening, and then use that when it's relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. That's deep. I want to switch gears slightly. When we started off the conversation, you said you're a believer of God or in God, and also a family. Talk about your family a little bit, and what is that family like? Because we all have families on this call.
Yeah.
You mentioned 4 jobs.
Yeah.
And I know you have a wife and a daughter. How are you managing that? Just keeping everybody happy and taking care of. How do you do all of that?
Well, my goal is to keep everybody with joy, not necessarily keep them happy.
Okay.
Only because happiness is an emotion that can change commonly, constantly. And if I'm always responding to the need to make them happy, then I'm going to lose. But if I create an atmosphere of joy and peace, then I won. And I think I can do that with the help of God.
I'm taking notes on that.
Yeah, that's a word right there.
I'm just saying, like, I had a professor one time say he had 6 kids, and 3 of which lived with him in Michigan, and the other 3 were older and lived with his previous wife in, I think, Alabama it was. And he said, I said, man, you got 6. How in the world do you do that? And you got 3 of them are away. And he said, man, what I've learned over the last few years is that it's not about frequency or amount. It's about the quality, right? And that there is no such thing as true balance. What it is that when you are present, be 100% present. And so what I've done, and I learned this during my dissertation, to negotiate the terms early. So I said to my wife, this is what I'm trying to do with my dissertation. And this is what I can commit to, and this is what I need support with. And I've been doing that ever since, really just explaining to her what I believe will be true for me in terms of the things that I'm balancing. And then when she needs me to be something, then I will commit to that. But outside of that, I'm trying to be the man that I want to be in all areas, not just in my marriage and as a father. And so if she feels like, honey, you're not doing enough here, I want her to be very mindful and say that to me, and then tell me what she needs in order to make her happy, Chris. But she has to articulate that. Otherwise, I'll sort of feel my environment as I'm intending to create joy, and I'll sense what needs to happen. For case in point, 2 days ago, I took the 2 days off. I don't usually take days off, but I knew I needed to do that, and I spent most of the time.
And Carl, I mean, you're making so many good points, and one thing I've always thought about is like, you know, where in the male development do we kind of like start to learn these things, or it's almost like we got to take a crash course in terms of communicating and relationships and understanding how to deal with work-life balance and all those things. But like, where do you see we can, even as educators, all of us start to like implement these learnings or these teachings for our young men to like start to kind of think over, like, is it too early to do it in high school, or is college at the grade level or the age where like they should start thinking about how to develop and cultivate relationships healthily, like you're speaking of?
I think there is no such thing as too early. And I think when things are healthy around us, it starts as soon as we're born. It's cultivated through a modeled relationship. It's cultivated through that initial connection with our mother who's healthy as we lay on her chest, and then she soothes us, and it transcends through our developmental life. Unfortunately, many of us are not necessarily, particularly minority males, are not necessarily positioned with the most optimal environments. Now, we have good ones, but it's not the best environment because there's an absence of something, typically. And so there is a need for us to connect to other surrogates. But the short answer to your question is really, there is no such thing as too early. It needs to happen as soon as it can happen. And we need to value the relationships that we have around us. I had a father, and he was excellent. And he was excellent in terms of his effort and his intention to be a father. But he had some absences in his skill set because he didn't meet his father until he was 16. And so he was present, but he wasn't always emotional, right? So I met a man who was my elementary principal, Black male. He was probably about 43 years old. His name was Virgil Madden. He was the first sensitive Black man I ever met. And when I say sensitive, I don't mean in terms of derogatory. I don't mean in terms of his sexual orientation. I mean in terms of his openness and his willingness to be emotional and to share his emotions with me, and then to share his expectations of me in a soft way, not a hard way, soft way. He was the first man to believe in me in the context of education. And I wrote in my dissertation a story to him ultimately to thank him for his role in cultivating a version of me that wasn't yet true.
I mean, because and to that point, I guess like us as Black male educators, we serve that role into making sure we're helping students build those healthy character traits or skills in relationships. But it's just like, to me, man, I wish it was almost like a way that we could teach it formally, like in school. You know what I mean? Like there has to be a space, social emotional learning or whatever, a space where not just boys, but boys and girls can learn how to kind of like identify their gaps in how they develop relationships and how they receive, or even just their emotions. I think that's super important. And now that we're in this virtual learning space, not to really like change the subjects, but now that we're in this virtual learning space, how much is that going to affect our students who aren't getting that social emotional learning that they get out of their Black male educators or their Black female educators because of that space that we're in, right?
Yeah.
And just for me as a teacher, before I even felt like I was effective as a teacher, I think that like my best skill set was my relationships with the students, right? Being there for them, being wholly there for them, like to be able to talk about anything, to be able to like have a listening ear, to also model just empathy and model like affection and all those things. I think that was important for their development just as it was in schoolwork. So like, you know, we got to figure out a way to like, how do we support kids and even in this space when now they're not able to meet in person?
Yeah, and we can certainly transition to that conversation. I want to say back to that point though that I am a believer, howbeit biased, that without the social emotional skills, that education will not go as far as it could go. And I believe that that's the foundation of education. If you have confident, healthy, emotionally intelligent people in front of you, they will respond to the academic rigor. So it's important for us to create healthy, emotionally intelligent, present kids so that they can ultimately be reactive to the environment that demands from them educationally, academically, rigor. And so I support your thoughts on that. And I believe that any listener needs to understand that the foundation of education needs to be wellness, emotional wellness for all kids, particularly though for the most at-risk kids, the marginalized kids, the historically marginalized kids, because they're often not necessarily in environments where that is always happening for them. In the models that they may have may not be conducive to the wellness that they desire, even though there might be a relationship there. And so being mindful that we have to create these healthy spaces. And the last thing I'll say in response to that is, I think that we need to do a better job of creating spaces where kids get to reflect. There's a lot of teachers who do didactic instruction, right? A lot of teachers that do scaffolding. And then the last part is really around reflection, but we don't necessarily give a lot of time for reflection. And when I talk about reflection, I don't mean let's reflect on the math. I mean, let's reflect on who I am, how I am in this world, and my reaction to the environment around me, and what are those challenges embedded in my environment, and how can you, teacher, support me in navigating those spaces? I will work hard for you if I know that you are ultimately connected to who I deeply am and the needs that I have internally, which are my social emotional needs.
That's deep. Great stuff. So I'm going to ask one more question to push it a little bit further and give maybe some actionable information to the teachers listening. How do you begin and be that person for a student in this virtual reality we find ourselves in, because we know we have a lot of, the experience of our young people right now is varies widely between, depending on the student and their background in a lot of different ways. But what can teachers do now? Because right now I think a lot of teachers feel under pressure to get on these Zoom calls to try to continue to learn, and they are trying to balance it. But I do think for a lot of teachers right now, it's a very anxious time where your expectations, you're trying to balance this expectation for learning and rigor with being supportive. So just some thoughts you have on that balance that teachers are trying to find.
Yeah, I want to answer it this way. When we get on the plane, right, we are always told to put our mask on first before you can help others. And that's in this current context, masks are more and more important in the literal sense. But in the proverbial sense, I want to say that and really raise that up again, is that the best thing that teachers can do for kids right now is to first put their mask on. Put their mask on and be healthy. Be healthy emotionally. Be healthy psychologically. Be healthy spiritually. Be healthy physically. Be healthy. And then provide support. Now, the question is, what kind of support you could provide? Well, if you come on to our session, you'll hear some more specific strategies about that. But the most important thing that I want to leave us in this conversation with is be healthy first. Put your mask on.
Good. And that's an excellent plug right there for the upcoming event this week on May 7th, in which we're going to have Karlin back. We're going to be on a live online virtual session for anyone to tune into, in which we're going to talk deeper on some of these strategies. But I do think I like that cliffhanger we kind of left them with, at the start, because I do think a lot of listeners, I'm on the phone and texting teachers like all day. And I think it's kind of that invisible question, even if the teacher's not asking it, you can tell that the weight of the situation is weighing on people in different ways, and people do need to feel supported. But I like that first step of just putting your mask on first, really, considering your own health, because if you're not healthy, it's going to be next to impossible for you to help someone else who may be in need. So I appreciate that.
And to that point, man, I think that also just understanding that not being okay is okay, right? That it's like a lot of people are conflicted with not feeling okay because they see other people and they think like, oh, well, Dr. Tichenor, he's fine, like he's moving on the phone, like, oh, Chris is good, I should be good too. Like, why am I mentally not there yet? Why am I taking this harder than maybe other people are? And so I think to that point too, like understanding how to be okay with how your emotions are, understand that your emotions are valid, your feelings are valid, especially in a time like this.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Like, we talk about hypoactive and hyperactive kids a lot, right? Hyper is the kid that shows out their emotions externally, right? And we don't often think about the hypoactive kid, the kid that goes down in their emotions, sort of protects themselves, goes under the table. And I bring those two examples up. Just because you see adults look like they're okay doesn't mean they're okay. They could be the hyperactive adult. And don't assume that the people who are hyper reactive are not okay either, right? We need to do a better job of being ultimately open about how we're feeling. And I think this conversation that we're having and the conversations we'll have in the future will demonstrate that just because we have the intellectual knowledge and the capacity to know how to do things doesn't mean that we're always good at it. And we all are learning how to be better at it every day. I'm a workaholic. I don't do a great job of quote unquote balancing. Doesn't mean I don't know and understand the value of balance. And that's important for us to talk about openly and transparently.
Yeah, that's good, man. Something we have been doing the last few episodes is doing this kind of checking in on one another. So let's just kind of go around, and maybe Mike, you can start us off. We hear another week has passed. We're still under guidelines to stay self-quarantined. I know you have a son, and just how you doing personally, professionally. How's that balance, going for you?
I mean, I think it's up and down. To be transparent, the first couple weeks of like lockdown, I think I was in like a state of shock or like disbelief or denial or something like that. And I just, it was hard for me to work, even for the Zoom meetings. It was hard for me to kind of like focus on anything because I didn't want to accept it. Does that make sense? I didn't want to accept like, and then also me understanding like the scenarios that play out with this virus, like I kind of was like, I think more people were optimistic about it than I was. So I wasn't really like accepting it. And then, as the week's gone on, getting pushing through it to kind of like get things done and kind of finding a routine. Cause I'm definitely like a man of routine, like a creature of habit. I kind of fit into it. Like I kind of fell into it better, but, there are good days and bad days, just like anything else. And like, you try to, to Karlin's point, find joy in things that you enjoy, right? And use those moments to kind of like carry you through the day. But in a lot of self-reflection and a lot of just like, deep thought, it's just like, man, what does this world look like? Thinking about the future can make you anxious. So like my best advice to myself and to the people around me has always been like, focus on the now, focus on today, take it one day at a time, be okay. If it's not okay, it's okay. And, if you're feeling okay, keep rolling with it. So that's how I've been, man.
What about you, Karlin?
I second Mike's idea around initially feeling the shock of it. It happened so abruptly and quickly, right? We heard about it. Turns out, the world heard about it a while ago, but we heard about it. And then all of a sudden there was a need to shelter in place. And then all of a sudden, fortunate for me, there was a need to work from home. And in that response, I felt like I couldn't control anything, right? And as a person who is a type A like me, there's a need for me to control something. And the fact that things were happening to me and I had no say was a bit difficult to manage, to respond to. And so I have since learned how to control what I can control and to do a better job of not using my time to just be productive in terms of my work, but using the time to be productive in terms of every other aspect of who I am. And I will say that I've been more intentional about that this last 10 days, is taking my time, slowing down a little bit, and then being mindful of the things that are valuable to me that are beyond just productivity in terms of my work and my requirements therein. And so I'm better now since my last 2 days off. So, but before that, I think I wasn't doing as well as I would have liked to.
Yeah, that's good.
Chris?
I think one thing for me, I feel like overall I'm doing okay. Trying to, so let me just give you a little context. What was it, like last week, I believe both of my two oldest kids, their school started this online learning where they're actually conferencing in with teachers every day, which I love the teachers for doing that. And I've kind of had this thought, especially with my youngest, he's on a call like 2 or 3 times. He's 5. And I'm like, okay, when is too much, because I don't know, this has been on my mind lately. Like everyone's on these computer screens so much. And when are students having that, that learning through experience? Like how can we cultivate that in our homes? Particularly for the younger kids. Like I said, both of my kids are young. One is in 6th grade, one is in kindergarten. So that's just been on my mind a little bit because I don't want to get too, operational, just like, oh, okay, go log in, do this. But really, where's that time, that discourse, and that opportunity to learn through experience? So I think just as a society, we need to just be careful with that, maintaining that balance, and also just exploring ways. And it's no knock on either their teachers or schools, because I think they're doing a good job. But just overall, because I've been even reading that this could extend past now and through the summer. Their schools are both handing out computers, and they're in 2 different districts, but giving out laptops. And you think about the investment that is, and I'm not to be a conspiracy theorist or anything, but I'm thinking like, well, I don't think people are investing as much just for a couple of weeks. Like this could extend longer, or there's, you listen to the experts, that could happen. So I think it's just something to be mindful as we think about what learning for our young people looks like going forward, particularly if we have some ability to control that or influence it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Chris. And I'll just say that I part of my job here allows me to hear a lot about what a lot of districts are doing statewide. One district, instead of having something every day, they have something every other day. And the job of the parents who have the ability to do so is to translate what they learned the day before into practical things, right? So say we learn something about environmental science. The job of the parent now with some guided material is to go out and do the thing you learned about in outside, right? And so I think there are ways to get kids to still be exploratory without only being on technology, just with some creativity. And then the other thing, as far as in terms of parents, man, is there's so much outside that you can learn about if you're willing to just be present there and not focused on other things. When you take a walk and you allow your kids to just ask questions, because they do, and then just spend time having conversations with them. On my bike ride today with my daughter, she says, "Hey, Dad, did you know that Granddad had a hedgehog in his backyard? And did you know?" And she was asking all these questions. Now I could have been like, yeah, I knew that, or I could have a conversation with her about animals, the environment, how they live, how they survive, which is learning. It's just not necessarily based on the grade level expectations.
Yeah.
And to Chris's earlier point, like the uncomfortability of just sitting on a computer, I think that our initial response, or our response right now, was kind of like overcompensating for not really having any real answers. Not just like any specific school district, but I think as a country, like educationally, like our response was to try to overcompensate so that we're not leaving kids out to dry with nothing, or trying to keep the schedule as regular. But I think what this really has served to be is kind of just like a time to self-reflect and evaluate how we were doing things, and if it was truly like effective in the first place. Like, how many hours a day do kids really need to be learning to be effective? How many hours a day do people need to be working in order for it to be productive, right? People are realizing that their job can be done from home, or that meeting could be done in an email, or whatever the case may be. Kind of like starting to reevaluate our productivity as a country. And I think the real important part is like people are actually home with their families, which to me I think is the healthiest thing. And now trying to reevaluate, like, how do you kind of like structure, like Karlin said earlier, that quality time with your family, whether it's learning together as you guys walk, or spending quality time learning about each other emotionally, or building those emotional bonds. So there is like a little bit of sunshine in that rain, in terms of like families being able to kind of like have that opportunity, to spend time together. And then also us as a nation to kind of reevaluate what education looks like. Because we were getting there anyway. Kids are able to look up answers on the internet. Kids are able to, like the information is already at their fingertips. So how do we teach them how to learn differently than just giving them content that they could have found on their own anyway? So I think this is another thing that's kind of like helping us push how do we reimagine what education looks like.
Yeah, I would say that my biggest prayer, to your point, is still focused on those who don't necessarily have the family support to be able to learn independently. I still worry about that group of students, particularly who are already behind prior to the pandemic, and what it would look like in terms of their equity of access and opportunity for that material when we do go back to quote unquote normal, even though there will likely be a new normal. We need to find some strategies and think about how to support those students who are far behind in comparison to their colleagues.
Absolutely. And also students who are not in home situations that are conducive to learning or like safe. So that's another thing I've also worried about a lot. The school serves as more as just a place of learning, but also just a safe emotional space.
I think my hope is that people begin to value educators more so than ever. The challenge of managing 26 to 30 kids at once and all the dynamic needs. And many of us are struggling to manage our little 3 kids at home, frustrated. Like, can I get you back in school? Let's be mindful of the educator, the role of the educator, and be appreciative of the role of schools in the lives of us who are not necessarily in the educational field. This is a fundamental need that we have lost during this pandemic, and I hope that people recognize that.
Great. So as we get ready to wrap up, I just want to hit you with a couple of quick questions, Karlin. So we know we have the event coming up this week, May 7th. You can register at bmeaofmichigan.org. If you're listening or watching this, that's bmeaofmichigan.org. Check out the website and you'll see the flyer and all the information. But what can listeners expect if they decide to attend the virtual event, Karlin?
Yeah, number one, it's a conversation about putting your mask on. That's not the title of it, but we'll talk about strategies that adults, educators need to do in order to be well, be safe, be healthy, so that we know you good, so that you can now go and serve other people. Number two, it'll be about some examples, some national examples, statewide examples, local examples of ways that organizations are supporting educators to be able to support young people. Ultimately really translating what we talk about in terms of the educator wellness to ways that we can translate that same wellness to the young kids that we're serving. Now, we recognize that most of the support will be virtual, and we're limited in that way, but we'll talk a little bit about what to talk about, how to talk about it, and what kind of space to give kids to reflect on some things. And we've kind of given some ideas around that today, how to reflect and how to use those spaces to give kids a voice, and a time to share, and a time to feel connected, even in this space and time where there feels like limited connection opportunity.
Good. I want to ask you one more question, I believe. And we talked about this. We talked about a couple of influential Black men in your life, from your dad to Mr. Madden. But is there any other influential Black male educator or just man in general that's had a big impact on your life? If so, who was it and why?
Yeah. So I think I would love to say that I had an example every step of my career educationally, but not every year. Just there was these spaces and times. So Madden would be my elementary. Middle school, it was Mr. Rogers. He was my coach when I lived in North Carolina. He was the football coach, a very military-like individual. He ran the football team like that, but you could tell through his style that he deeply cared about your well-being and your best interests. In high school, I would say it was my high school coaches. They were also educators, so I don't want to say that they only were athletic. Mr. Rogers was also an educator who coached. And so being mindful of their roles in both settings. Rogers was a math teacher. So Mr. Wright and Mr. Lands were our basketball coaches, but both of them were educators, world history specifically. And they always demonstrated what they wanted us to do. So, for example, in athletics, if they wanted us to run 5 miles, they ran the miles with us. They didn't just talk, they demonstrated, they modeled, and they supported. And so those examples across my K to 12 experience, and there are many others, were very vital in terms of shaping me to believe in the role that an educator, but particularly an African-American educator in my case, to see that, to admire it, to look up to it, and then to see them be successful in it, which was really important, because you could see people who look like you, but if they're not necessarily demonstrating it the way that looks like success, it may not be helpful for you. But these individuals took pride in their work, took pride in their role, and were intentional about everything they did. And that was really helpful for me in shaping my desire to become college educated and ultimately be who I am today.
Good stuff. Mike, any last words for the listeners?
Any last words? I think that, this month being May and mental health, and our timing is perfect. I know it's getting warm. People are getting tired of this quarantine. So, keeping your head above you, above water. I just want to shout out everyone who's still working, who's still, that's still essential workers. I want to shout out everyone who's at home with their kids and doing the best they can. I do want to shout out the students. I saw some of my students today. I saw this week, I just see a lot of my students, man. It put a smile on my face to see them. So I want to shout out those students in my high school. And also the fellowship this past weekend. We started the fellowship, man. Shout out to all those brothers who are participating and trying to, put in more effort in becoming better educators and change education for our students, man. So shout out to them as well.
Yeah, we have so much going on right now. We had May being Mental Health Month and the stuff we're doing with you, Dr. Tichenor. We do have a fellowship going on every week. For those listeners who knew about the fellowship, it was not planned to be virtual, but we just adapted due to the times. And we had about almost 30 guys on in the first session. Like, I'm talking engaged, and I'll try to put some screenshots and some clips of it, because I did try to capture some of it, but That was great. And then we also have the work we're doing with the guys in Philly and in New York with the Village. So, BMEA, we're in the, we're blessed to be able to keep doing this work and been able to ramp some things up. And we definitely want to thank our guest today, Dr. Karlin Tichenor. I think this conversation has been great, and I think it's going to help a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So we definitely appreciate you taking the time to be here on the show. We're looking forward to having you the live event later on this week. So I just want to say thank you, man. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for the excellent work that you guys continue to do with this organization, but also in your role as educators. You're invaluable. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks a lot. We appreciate it. All right. On that note, we're going to sign off. Once again, this is the BMEA Podcast. We hope you're doing well during this time. Definitely share this with your networks and let someone else hear this message if you happen to hear it yourself. Take care, and we'll see you next time.